Hello, everyone. My name is Donna Hicks, and I'm the chair of the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar Series. And I'd like to welcome you all for this wonderful presentation that we're going to have today. And before we get started describing what's going to happen today and the name of the talk and all of that, I just want to let you know that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. And I'd like to thank my colleagues and my team here, Billy Fairfield, Diane Long, James Kerwin. Nicole Bryant isn't here today, but she's on vacation, but we all welcome you. We all are just so happy that you've chosen some time out of your busy day to come and listen to Suzanne Ghais today. So Suzanne is going to be talking about the prospects of peace in Cameroon's Anglophone crisis. And let me just tell you a little bit about the format of the session before I go and I introduce Suzanne. What we're going to do is have Suzanne talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A with you, the audience. And if you would please put your questions or comments in the Q&A function and not in the chat. And then I'm going to, at the end, when Suzanne is finished with her talk, I'm going to read her some of the questions as they come in. And I just want to apologize in advance. We typically have so many questions that I never get to and so little time that we sometimes don't have a chance to get everyone's question back. So in advance, I just want to warn you of that. But again, today we are just thrilled to have Suzanne Ghais with us today. She is the principal, it's Dr. Ghais, by the way. She's principal of Ghais Mediation and Facilitation, LLC, and the executive director of the nonprofit Pathfinders for Peace, and has over 25 years experience as a mediator, a facilitator, and a trainer. She's helped resolve conflicts and build consensus in internal organizational matters and environmental land use issues, and is increasingly working on or in peace processes and political transitions. Her publications include Extreme Facilitation, Guiding Groups Through Controversy and Complexity, and she's done significant recent scholarly research on peace processes. So as I said, we're so grateful to all of you for showing up here with us today, and I'm going to turn this over right away to Suzanne so we can get started. Suzanne?
Thank you. Great to see everybody. Thank you so much to all of you for allowing me to shine a light on this very underreported conflict. So, prospects for peace in Cameroon's conflict that is most broadly known as the Anglophone crisis, although that nomenclature is itself somewhat contested. That's why I put it in quotation marks. This presentation is attempting to be suitable for all audiences. So I'm sure there are people here who know way more about it than I do, and others who may know nothing at all about this conflict. So I'm going to start at the very beginning with basics, such as, where is Cameroon? There it is, right next to Nigeria on the western coast of Africa, but it is considered a Central African country in terms of membership in regional organizations and so forth. I will touch on just a few critical points in history. I'm not going to attempt to give a full history, but on the left, the map on the left shows the German colony of Cameroon that was prior to World War I. And then after World War I, if you skip to the third map there, the British and French divided up Germany's colonies in Africa. So the part in blue came under control of the French. It was French Cameroon with an O-U-N. And the part shown in green came under British control. So that's British Cameroons with an S. Onto the map on the right, in 1960, the French part became independent, became the Republic of Cameroon, or La République du Cameroun. And the part that had been British, there was a Northern Cameroons and a Southern Cameroons. So the UN Trust entity did not give the former British portion the chance to vote for independence. Rather, they gave them a choice of either joining the French Republic of Cameroon or joining Nigeria in a referendum. So the parts shown in yellow, Northern Cameroons, voted to join Nigeria. And the part shown in sort of that fuchsia pink voted to join French Cameroon. And that is the territory that we're sort of focusing on in this talk today. One way to understand the history is represented in these two flags. So after the former British Cameroon, Southern Cameroons joined Cameroon, it was a federal system. This was in the Constitution. So there were two entities represented here by these two stars that constituted the country. Over time, however, the central government of Cameroon, probably because the model of governance they knew was the French colonial model, which is extremely centralized in Paris. They looked to sort of gradually undermine the distinct institutions of the former British territory and kind of make the country more homogeneous, if you will. Again, probably just trying to emulate what they thought governance was supposed to be. And in 1975, the flag was changed to one star, symbolically erasing the distinctness of the former British area and its people. So that was one of the critical moments. Another way to understand the history is looking at these maps. So you can see, you may not be able to see this very well, but the portion here that used to be British was called West Cameroon. This is a 1961 map. So upon the joining of the two portions, West Cameroon was a former British part, and the rest was called East Cameroon. So those were the two federal entities. In 2008, the government of Cameroon sort of redrew the internal borders and created these 10 regions. So the former British Southern Cameroons is now called the Northwest and Southwest regions. So the nomenclature in this, for people who are unfamiliar, is very confusing. Like, how can it be the South, but the West, but the Northwest and Southwest? So this helps show you why. So to summarize very, very briefly, the views of the two sides, and even calling it two sides is a gross oversimplification, but essentially the grievances of the English speakers, those who live in the former British portion, is that they've been marginalized and denied equal access to education, to justice, to other services, development, I mean, roads, all of it. And keep in mind that the British model of education and also the British legal system are quite distinct from the French models. And so the institutions were really different. And as I said before, the central government tried to undermine that distinctness of the British portion. And people who speak English and not French report having been kind of sneered at, humiliated, treated as second-class citizens since the beginning. On the government side, the view, at least in recent years, is that they have worked to address these grievances. And to their minds, this marginalization is a thing of the past. And they say, hey, we even held a national dialogue on these issues and are currently implementing its recommendations. I'll be going into that dialogue a little later in the presentation. But the recommendations included a special status for the again, what the government calls the Northwest and Southwest regions. So in 2016, as the central government was still sending teachers and judges and lawyers who didn't speak English into the English-speaking regions, there were mass peaceful protests led initially by teachers and lawyers, but they spread much broader than that. But there were violent responses by the security forces. I mean, this is often the recipe for how civil wars start in many places. Again, fast forwarding, jumping over a lot of detail, but there was a movement for independence that actually had existed for some time. But of course, these events gave it steam. And so the independent aspirational country of Ambazonia, named after the Amba Bay, was declared October 1st, 2017. And this is its flag. The leaders of that movement, after there was a brief attempt at negotiation, the leaders fled to Nigeria. But in Nigeria, the Nigerian security forces captured them and imprisoned them. And so the original interim president of Ambazonia, Sisiku Ayutabe, was one of those imprisoned, and he is still in prison. That's a critical point in the memories of those who advocate for independence, because they have reason to fear setting foot in Cameroon or even in neighboring countries. So the conflict that has been raging ever since, I guess we're at 6 years now, has generally been known as the Anglophone crisis. Many of its leaders are in the diaspora, and many of those here in the United States. And I've met quite a few of them in the events that we held. We in the organization that has since formed and became Pathfinders for Peace. As part of the dynamics of this conflict, legitimacy is contested. And again, fairly typical of civil wars, insurgencies, and so forth. On the part of those who advocate for independence and even other more moderates, they see Francophone rule as illegitimate because the former British Southern Cameroons was never given the option of independence. And so it was, in their view, an aborted decolonization process. On the government side, of course, a state is supposed to have the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And so the non-state actors here, the Amba Boys, which is a loose term for the many armed groups fighting for independence, they are criminals, they are terrorists. The government has called them terrorists. And we, the government, are the legitimate actor here. There have, not surprisingly, been atrocities committed by both sides, some similar, some different on the two sides, but each side has violently punished those suspected of being loyal to or serving as informants to the other side. On the government side, they have burned homes, imprisoned people without due process. There have been a lot of reports of torture, and sometimes torture coupled with serious humiliation, like forcing people to eat their own excrement, things like that, and extrajudicial killings. On the side of the Amba Boys, what started as a peaceful protest technique called ghost towns, meaning general strikes that are every Monday, those have become pretty much permanent. And also the Amba Boys believing that government schools are illegitimate public schools. Essentially, they've closed down a lot of schools. And so there are many children who have been without an education for 6 years now. And so they've established these kinds of rules or laws, and those who violate them may have their fingers or hands or arms amputated. In the case of teachers, this is so that they can't hold a piece of chalk and teach. There have been countless kidnappings for ransom. This is one of the major fundraising methods of the Amba Boys, and killings on that side as well. And meanwhile, sexual violence on all sides is pervasive. the picture shown here on the right is, I met with a family who were displaced from the conflict zone. The woman there had been kidnapped once and managed to escape. And then she heard that they were coming for her again. And so her family fled. And this is two members, but there were 22 people living in this 2-bedroom shack. It was really a shack with 1 bathroom. This is not an atypical experience of the hundreds of thousands who have been displaced. So I want to clarify a few things. First of all, when people think about, civil wars and intercommunal conflict, they think of situations maybe like Palestine, Israel, or Kashmir, where the communities themselves have a lot of hatred and distrust and so forth. This particular conflict is not like that. This is not an intercommunal conflict. This is a conflict between a geographically concentrated minority and the government. In fact, I have found in my now 3 visits to Cameroon, the Cameroonians are really exceptionally tolerant people. I took a picture here of somebody in traditional dress chatting with somebody in modern dress. There are Protestants, Catholics, Muslims who all sort of mix and mingle freely. There are people in all kinds of dress and background, speaking all kinds of different languages. I mean, there is French on the French side and English on the English side as being the main languages, but there are also the indigenous languages that are often spoken. So all kinds of people sort of mix very tolerantly, it seems to me. And a lot of the displaced people, while some have fled to Nigeria or elsewhere, many have just moved to Yaoundé or other French-speaking cities. I also want to clarify that the Francophones have grievances too. I mean, this is a government that quashes dissent. There have been recent killings of journalists who have been critical of the government. There are a lot of problems, but the Francophones don't have the same experience of being treated as second-class to the second-class citizens the way the English speakers have been. Also, as I said, I have grossly oversimplified. There are not just 2 sides and not just 2 viewpoints. And even within the Southern Cameroons / Northwest and Southwest, there is the entire spectrum of opinion. There are English speakers in the central government. The prime minister is traditionally an English speaker, and the current one is. So there's the whole spectrum from wanting to continue as a unitary state through federalism or other alternatives to independence. Now let me shift to efforts to make peace, which is really the central focus of my talk. So from the beginning of the crisis, there were a number of actors that came through and offered to mediate, such as the Vatican and the community of Sant'Egidio, which is close to the Vatican, the European Institute of Peace, and I think others. The one that initially gained the most traction was known as the Swiss Initiative. The Swiss Foreign Ministry partnered with the HD Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is an NGO with a lot of expertise on peace processes. And the HD Center worked with several pro-independence groups. Mainly in 2019, there was a series of meetings held, and they managed to help organize, out of the many different groups, pro-Ambazonia groups, help them form a coalition called the Ambazonia Coalition Team, or ACT. However, there are other groups that did not participate. You might remember I mentioned Sisiko Ayutabe, so he was the original interim president of Ambazonia, but in early 2019, another group split off from that and formed a competing interim government. So that second group was at the core of ACT. But those still loyal to Sisiko Ayutabe were among those who did not participate. So that's just one example. The Swiss claimed to have a mandate from the Cameroon government. Nobody ever saw anything in writing that I have heard, so it may have been just a verbal mandate. And And for a long time, this was the peace process that the international community was saying, we support the Swiss process and so forth. But they never really got much traction with the government. There were, to my knowledge, no formal meetings. There were some meetings between, the Swiss foreign minister and the Cameroonian president or foreign minister, but no peace process meetings per se, that as far as I can tell. And this is partly because at one point, the government of Cameroon decided, hey, we need to have a process of our own. And so that brings us to the major national dialogue. So timeline here, the conflict started 2017. The Swiss initiative started, I think, either late 2018 or early 2019. Formation of ACT was around August 2019. And the major national dialogue was announced with, I think it was just about a month's advance notice. So it was planned and executed very, very quickly under the leadership of the Prime Minister. The dialogue took place September 30th to October 4th, so 1 week, 2019, and probably in response to the pressure to resolve this conflict peacefully. And that pressure came both from international actors and domestic civil society actors. So all of those, while not necessarily coordinated, they were kind of singing in harmony, if you will. The dialogue was open to all, but remember back to that situation of leaders being sent from Nigeria back to Cameroon to be put in prison. And so those leaders in the diaspora who support an independent Ambazonia were afraid to set foot in Cameroon, and that was not an irrational fear. So in effect, it excluded the leaders of that movement. Another criticism of the national dialogue is that it was designed unilaterally. This was not designed as an equal partnership with the AMBA movement. And it did produce a lot of recommendations on a variety of different things that were attempting to address both the grievances that led to the conflict as well as the effects of the conflict. So things about disarmament and reintegration of fighters, things like that. And special status was the sort of solution put forward to this conflict. It was at least a milestone, as an excellent report from the International Crisis Group explained. It was still a milestone in that it officially recognized that the former British portion of the country was distinct and should be treated distinctly in legally in a legal or constitutional way. But it clearly failed to resolve the conflict. So back to the international actors. The Swiss process was, I would say, on life support for a long time, but then finally declared dead. I think that was early 2020, late 2021 or early 2022. Canada had helped fund that process. And thanks to the advocacy of groups such as Canadians for Peace and Justice in Cameroon, Canadian groups, as well as the fact that Canada has a bilingual model, right? It's flip-flopped there, where the French speakers in Quebec are the minority, but they have a model for autonomy and bilingualism. So Canada held 3 rounds of what were described as pre-talks or pre-negotiation meetings, very quiet, in the fall of 2022, so just last fall, with delegations from both sides. I want to point out that the Cameroon government would not have sent a delegation without the approval of the head of state, President Paul Biya. So the government was participating. These meetings also included an Ambazonia delegation that was pretty broad. As I said, there's a fragmented movement with lots of different groups. This included quite a lot of them. It's very difficult to quantify beyond that, but it was pretty broad. And they talked not only about process, but some substantive issues as well, such as a ceasefire and humanitarian corridors. So this got really quite far, quite a bit farther than the Swiss process had gotten. And I want to mention here that this is kind of typical of peace processes, that it's common to take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and then people learn and regroup and figure out things to do differently. Another 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So get ready, because we're going to hear about more of that. So in January of this year, this process went public. And you'll see here, I just took a screenshot of an announcement by the Canadian government, which you can find online. On January 20th, Canada announced it had a mandate to facilitate a peace process. It was January 20th, so wow, huge, huge news. January 21, the Ambazonians announced that they had some problems with the nomenclature used in the Canadian announcement. The Canadians called it the Northwest and Southwest regions instead of the apparently agreed upon language of the former British territory of Southern Cameroons. But nevertheless, they said, we need to do this, we're still in. So who does that leave? The government. On January 23rd, the Cameroon government announced that it had not agreed to any of this. They had not authorized any foreign facilitator or mediator, and the announcement cited the major national dialogue as the process for addressing this conflict. So completely pulled the plug. This was a stunning chain of events. So, and I want to mention another irony here is that the Ambazonians have been lectured a lot by Western experts on the conflict that they need to unify, that they are too fragmented. The government doesn't know who to talk to. They have to unify. And yet here it appears to have been divisions within the Cameroon government, not the Ambazonia side, that seems to have led to the collapse here. So there is something of an irony there. We at Pathfinders for Peace took a trip just last month, late March. And of course, we were very curious to try to understand what had happened here. As we typically do, we met with some government officials. This time, that included 2 officials from the security sector, separate meetings, one from the army, one from the gendarme, as well as meeting with a couple of foreign missions in the capital. We didn't find out exactly the chain of events that led to pulling the plug, but we did learn that that public rollout may have been problematic from the standpoint of the Cameroon government. I want to acknowledge that, I'm not blaming this on the Canadians or on any one group. It was apparently a negotiated procedure for rolling it out publicly. But nevertheless, there were many in government who actually were not officially informed of this process because it was supposed to be secret. And so the first time they heard about it publicly or officially was from a foreign government. And that felt like kind of upstaging the Cameroonian government. So it was weird to them. At the same time, and in comparison, especially to my last trip to Cameroon before that, which was in June 2021, we sensed a greater openness to the idea of negotiation generally as a way to address the conflict. That is really quite big news to my mind. There's, I think maybe, and it's hard to say for sure because there are so many different opinions and so forth, but from the people we spoke to, I sensed a new openness. Also, and this does not have anything to do with resolving the conflict, but more about conflict management. And I heard this from very diverse sources, that both sides have been taking more caution not to harm civilians. So where it used to be, oh, you're informing the other side, so we're going to shoot first, ask questions later. Now it's, let's take you in for questioning and we might let you go. So the level of violence against civilians seems to be going down, which I think is really unexpected and positive news. So in conclusion, what are the prospects for peace in this now 6-year-old conflict? Many of you probably know Bill Zartman's concept of a mutually hurting stalemate. That concept refers both to the military situation on the ground as well as the perceptual situation. Do parties to a conflict feel that they are stuck? And I think that that condition probably does apply here. People are tired. Those fighting for independence, some of them thought the fight would be over in a few months or a year. The government is, wanted to say, oh, we're winning. This is a matter of time, but it's kind of dragging on. So I think that's one factor in favor of better prospects for peace. Another factor that I personally think is at least as important as the hurting stalemate is what is the attitude of the international community and how unified are they? And I think it is and has been true for a long time that foreign governments, at least, are more or less in agreement that there needs to be some political, peaceful solution here. Foreign governments also seem to agree that that solution needs to maintain the existing borders of the country. But there are a lot of options within that for more autonomy for the former British portion of the country. So there is a pretty wide agreement. I mean, there are permutations. A lot of people wonder about the French, who prefer to deal kind of quietly and bilaterally with the Cameroon government. But this seems to be where most governments, where all governments who care about this conflict pretty much are. One humongous unknown factor is succession of leadership of the country. President Paul Biya recently turned 90. And there are questions about his mental state. There's some signs that he may be suffering from dementia. And, the Constitution of Cameroon lays out a procedure whereby if the president dies or is incapacitated, the presidency is passed to the president of the Senate. But I'm not hearing that being a likely chain of events. It seems likely that there will be some leadership struggle, and it seems to me a possibility that that could become a violent struggle, that this whole conflict might become a sideshow. I don't know how likely that is, but it's one of the possible scenarios. The Canadians are still open to helping. They made a point to tell me, and they wanted me to share that they are not trying to impose anything on anyone. They are offering to help, to provide a forum, to facilitate, but not to impose anything on anyone. The Canadians don't have the depth of experience in peacemaking that countries such as Norway does, for example, but they have brought in a lot of folks to help, some people from the UN and elsewhere. So they are really trying. I think after the things we learned last month, that any peace process needs to somehow honor or acknowledge the national dialogue. Now, that doesn't mean that anyone has to accept that the national dialogue is it or that special status is the solution, but rather just somehow tie in with or acknowledge it. One idea that I've been kind of rolling around in my mind, and I've talked with a few people about, is the possibility of using the occasion of the 4-year anniversary of the national dialogue to conduct a sort of public assessment of it. Not just how implementation is going, because there already is a process to monitor and track implementation, but rather reassessing the entire process. What were the strengths of it? What were the weaknesses? How could those be corrected? How could it be made more inclusive and more legitimate and more of a real partnership? So conducting that as I said, on the occasion of an anniversary, the 4-year or maybe even the 5-year next year. And that could be either combined with negotiations in some way, or just a separate and parallel track. One thing I have written about, and many others have too, is the importance of somehow involving civil society in a peace process. Now, a peace process has to include the men with the guns, because those are the ones who can choose to put those guns and other weapons down. So they have to be included. And I also advocate for inclusivity in terms of the different armed groups. Okay, I don't think it has to be just one group that represents an insurgency or rebel movement. I think it can be many. But back to civil society, if the negotiations only take place between the men with the guns, there is a danger, and we've seen this elsewhere in non-inclusive peace processes, that it just becomes a negotiation over who gets what kind of political power, and it's too easy to ignore the conditions of the people on the ground and what are the political issues, the economic issues that actually need to be resolved. Involvement of civil society helps ensure that focus stays on the needs of the population. And so I'm talking about women's groups, youth groups, religious actors. And by the way, there was a group of religious leaders who wrote a letter of support of the Canadian process when it was first announced. Traditional leaders remain important actors. Human rights activists and other civil society groups are very important to have their voices in some way incorporated into a peace process. With that, I will turn it back to Professor Hicks, and I will be delighted to take your questions both in English and in French. We can, I can translate any questions that we have in French.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. I mean, I can't tell you how instructive and informative this was for me. The details of this, you get the broad strokes when you're not directly involved in a conflict such as this, but thank you for exploring all the nuances and articulating them in such an easy to understand way. I know that that's hard to do. So thank you so much. And we have many questions, and of course, as I predicted, we probably won't be able to get to all of them. And I first want to say, for the people who have asked the questions, if I mess up your name, I'm going to apologize in advance. The first question that I have, Suzanne, is from Dennis Atemkeng. What are the principles of the UN Charter that underlie our proposals for a solution?
Yes, thank you for that. And that is a name I recognize, so I'm glad you joined us, Mr. Atemkeng. For better or for worse, the UN Charter doesn't say a lot about internal conflicts. In fact, it explicitly says that the UN is not to meddle in issues that are what's the language? The essential purview of the state or something like that are internal issues. Now, if you believe in a separate Ambazonia, you don't regard it as an internal issue. You don't regard Ambazonia as part of the Republic of Cameroon, and I understand that. But for better or worse, the international community does view it as within the existing borders of Cameroon. So I think in terms of the UN Charter, the pieces that speak to it most are around human rights and peace and security for all. And those were articulated more subsequent to the UN Charter in human rights treaties. So I would probably lean on those more in terms of how people are treated within the internationally recognized state. So I'm sorry, there's not much in the UN Charter. People talk about the principle of self-determination, but that norm was really more live around the end of colonialism. And nowadays, and since the UN Charter, the norm of territorial integrity tends to trump the norm of self-determination. I still think self-determination could be realized potentially in some way but there's not much in the charter that says, hey, you should get independence.
Suzanne, before I move on, I was curious about how you suggested that maybe the 4th anniversary of the national dialogue would be an opportune time to reflect and to see what was missing, what was good, and all that. Was civil society involved in that national dialogue?
Yeah, I don't think they were invited in terms of, named stakeholder groups. I think it was more, I guess I don't know all that many details of how they were involved, but there were different commissions. I think there were 8 different commissions of the National Dialogue, each led by a number of vice presidents. Some of those came from civil society organizations. And then I think that the door was open for individuals to participate as individuals. So it was more, I guess, more akin to public meetings than stakeholder negotiations or dialogues.
Yeah. All right, thanks. And Remy is just adding a comment here to your explanation, an answer to the previous question. He's saying, but is it not an internal issue because there was no union treaty?
Yeah, I mean, I understand those arguments, and I'm somewhat sympathetic to those arguments that the people of the British Southern Cameroons were somewhat against their will incorporated into Cameroon. It's a bit of a similar argument to the Moro, the Muslim population of the southern Philippines. They were conquered. The sultanates of the southern Philippines were conquered. Well, really not fully, but the Philippines were conquered by the Spanish. And the sultanates of the South never accepted Spanish rule, and they fairly successfully resisted it for hundreds of years. And so when in the Treaty of 1898 that transferred, where Spain sold the Philippines to the US, they argued, well, we were never part of the Spanish Philippines, so we were not legitimately brought under US control, and therefore, we're not legitimately part of the Philippine state. So again, I understand those kinds of arguments, but for better or worse, the international community still views the Philippines as one state and still views Cameroon, including the former British Southern Cameroons, as one state. So I hear and understand the arguments. I'm not stating agreement or disagreement. I'm just saying, so far from what I've seen, that hasn't gained a lot of traction internationally.
Okay, Suzanne, this is an anonymous attendee, and the question is, has any of the conveners ever found any instrument, either in the form of a UN resolution or a treaty of union, which makes the Southern Cameroons and French Cameroon one country?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, has any of the conveners ever found any instrument, either in the form of a UN resolution or a treaty of union, which makes the Southern Cameroon and French Cameroon one country?
Okay, I think this is harking back to the same argument that the joining of the former British Southern Cameroons with La République du Cameroun was never official, it was never agreed, it was never legitimate.
Okay, let's move on to Val Clark, who is asking, is China active here since it has sea access as a mode of greater investment to Africa's interior states? Colonial influence will still socially active, but China's incentives are attractive to many areas of Africa.
Oh yeah, China's very active in Cameroon. China is exercising influence through infrastructure is how I look at it. And the Chinese are very active in development projects in Cameroon, as in many other African countries, and trying to obtain more influence that way. So yes, they're there. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Emmanuel Chebe is asking, are there alternative arrangements under the radar for children to access education? The evolution of this distressing situation is understandable in terms of its history, but is intervention, like the Swiss Foreign Ministry, is intervention welcome? is there any governmental focus on restoring education so critical for the development of future citizens?
Yes, the parties have been addressing this. On the Ambazonia side, they have set up their own separate schools. Also, some religious actors, there are Catholic schools and other religious schools. The government is still trying to, the central government of Cameroon is still trying to operate its public schools. I think back to the Ambazonia side, there has been some loosening. Some of the groups are pulling away from discouraging people to go to the government schools. So it's not all children that are lacking education, and it depends what local area specifically you're talking about. So some kids have gotten back in school, but some still have not. It is really tragic. And with kids not in school, there are all kinds of impacts from that, not just loss of education, but increases in use of drugs and out of wedlock pregnancies and all kinds of things. It's horrible.
Yeah, real tragedy. So Paul Zeeby is asking, the Republic of Cameroon, and it's in quotes, yeah. This is the international noun of the country in English. Saying something else is just propaganda, and it doesn't help to bring all the atrocities to an end.
Okay. So saying something else besides calling it Cameroon?
The Republic of Cameroon.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps this questioner is saying, like, let's not get hung up on symbolic issues. We have to really address the problems, which, I'm inclined to agree. But there are those who say, hey, if you call the Southern Cameroon, the former British Southern Cameroon, that is legitimizing an illegitimate government. So that's one perspective. And on the other side, if, from the perspective of those who advocate the position of the government of Cameroon, calling it Southern Cameroons, calling it Ambazonia, all of that is illegitimate. So that's back to the contested legitimacy. But I am certainly for trying to solve the underlying problems as opposed to getting hung up on symbolic issues. But symbolic issues are very important for many.
And a PS to his question is, don't you think this issue is a constitutional issue and should end up with a constitutional response, including, for example, a constitutional amendment on the form of the state?
Yeah, the form of the state is kind of the big question here. That's the phrase that is used, is what is the form of the state? Will it be unitary? Will it be special status, federalism, et cetera? And so, yes, that is the ultimate core question that should be resolved through, I think, should be resolved through negotiation. And there are other issues as well that have to deal with people's more day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
Well,
here's another anonymous question, Suzanne. What are the conditions for such crises to be discussed at the UN Security Council? I see how the UN always convene whenever crises as such erupts. Sudan, DRC, Ethiopia. Is Cameroon different?
Such a great question. It is so baffling why this has not been on the agenda of the Security Council. And okay, I will acknowledge there was one meeting called an ARIA formula meeting, which is UN speak for this isn't really a Security Council meeting. It's just kind of a little talk, a little thing. And that was, I think, in early 2019, maybe earlier. But basically, it has not been on the agenda. And the whole thing is baffling, and why this conflict gets so little attention. I have been following with a very heavy heart the recent violence in Sudan. And I could spend more time talking about that. It's an incredibly important issue. And I'm glad that I'm seeing things about it on CNN and in the Washington Post. But at the same time, I'm like, Why hasn't Cameroon and this crisis gotten more coverage, and why hasn't the Security Council picked it up? Explanations I've heard are the international community needs Cameroon in the Lake Chad Basin to counter the Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa Province. So it's part of the counterterrorism drive. Secondly, Cameroon receives and has welcomed refugees from Central African Republic. And so, their international community is sort of grateful for that. Paul Biya's age, at least among Africans, there is a very strong norm of respecting your elders. And so in the African Union, I'm answering a different question, the African Union rather than the UN. But in the African Union, some say, well, he's the sort of great granddaddy of the African leaders. And so, we can't it's not appropriate to challenge him too much. The French have always somewhat protected their former colonies. Those of you who know much about the Rwandan genocide know that at least initially the French were kind of protecting the government that turned out to be pretty complicit in the genocide. So these are some of the explanations I've heard.
Yeah, and Boniface Noyongoya asks, well, you've already addressed the UN, but he's saying, where are the two colonial powers, Great Britain and France, in this?
Yeah. Great Britain has, I think, more or less supported the Swiss effort. I think they're supporting the Canadian effort. France, as I said, tries to keep it on the down low and stick to bilateral relations with the government. That said, I think that they have exerted a bit of pressure on the government, but quietly, pressure to engage in peacemaking. What else? I mean, it's come up in the British Parliament. It's come up in the French Parliament. So to some extent, everybody's sort of at a loss, as to what to do. The British have to some extent supported the Rapid Intervention Battalion, the BIR, that's the French BIR, the French acronym, which is a kind of special forces of the military. And there again, I think the concern of counterterrorism is the reason for that, but that same force has become active in the former British areas and at least allegedly, I'm sure it's true, violated human rights quite a lot. But hey, they're helping us in counterterrorism, so we stay quiet. I think that might be part of it.
That might be part of it, yeah. So John Packer wants to know, from your professional perspective, do you believe the Canadian public announcement of mediation is, number one, usual, number two, smart, advisable, number three, now harmful, not just problematic? Presuming that you agree this was at least problematic, what do you believe it indicates?
Yes, another name I recognize. So glad you're here, John Packer. To my understanding, and what I've heard unofficially from people who probably weren't supposed to talk about this, it was a negotiated rollout. So, yes, I do at least believe it was problematic. There's not a formula. Every peace process it has to be figured out on its own. There are some lessons across peace processes, but each has to figure out its own path. So I can't say, oh, gee, normally this should be done in month 9 instead of month 3. Like I can't say that for sure. I do think it, in effect, was problematic. I wonder about the Cameroonian negotiating team and how much they were in communication with others within their government as this was happening. yeah, maybe one argument is that it all should have just been still kept confidential, that it just shouldn't have been made public at all. And there are pros and cons to that. My mentor, Anthony Wani St. John, wrote a great book on back channel negotiations in the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine peace process. And, one among his conclusions is that, secrecy is really, really helpful in negotiations, right? To keep it out of the public eye so people can be frank and really dig in to the issues without performing to an audience. But over time, what happened with the talks that led to Oslo and so forth was that the secrecy prevented the ability of parties to build public support for what was being negotiated. And so then you had, Yitzhak Rabin assassinated shortly after as a result, and other, ultimately it all fell apart. So at some point, I think peace processes do need to become public. Was it too soon? Maybe. As I described, I think the problem that we learned last month was on the Cameroon government side, and we need to kind of figure out how to get them back into negotiations. And I think that requires some acknowledgement of how this landed, how these announcements landed. I think that's the best I can do.
Thank you, Suzanne. So this, I'm afraid, is going to have to be the last question, and it's one that's kind of dear to my heart. Negotiation has the potential to help over time if contesting parties could be involved in workshops, perhaps unofficial track 2 type of workshops, and educational, to influence the political parties. Is there any organized prospect for this type of workshop that might introduce methods of collaboration toward peace? I'm assuming perhaps, Suzanne, you do these sorts of workshops.
Well, we haven't. We did hold a workshop for sort of the Cameroonians in diaspora and Southern Cameroonians, in diaspora back in late 2019. We're interested in doing more of that sort of thing. And meanwhile, some others have too. Mediators Beyond Borders, USIP has done some workshops. So there are a number of other actors supporting kind of track 2 or back channeling, and we hope to be among those.
No, that would be great. Again, Suzanne, this always happens. We run out of time and we don't cover all the questions, but I'm sure people could reach out to you if they have any burning questions.
I welcome that.
Yeah. And I also want to point out that this session is being recorded. So anyone who wants to watch it again or, suggest to other people to view it, please, in about a day or two, check on the Program on Negotiation website under events, and you'll see Suzanne's talk there. And now I want to turn it over to James Kerwin, who is going to give some announcements about other upcoming PON activities. Go ahead, James.
Well, thank you, Donna, and thank you so much, Suzanne. I think we learned so much in just a short time, and thank you for this work and your continued commitment to it. We really appreciate everything you shared. Just want to let our audience know that we're going to have a few other events next week coming up. We're going to have David Hoffman and Helen Winter talking about reducing unconscious bias, and then Audrey Lee and Alain Lemper are going to join us to talk about turning difficult mediation moments into opportunities. So, and also this isn't going to be the last Kelman seminar. We're working together to put together another one, and keep your inboxes, keep eyeing your inbox, and we'll have an announcement about that shortly. Also, please join us in Cambridge for a class if you want to take negotiation and leadership, or we even have now virtual programs that we're doing late May and June. So, always thrilled to have such a great online community at PON, as well as our Cambridge community. So thank you for everyone who joined us from around the world. And thank you again, Suzanne.